Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks and glad to be back. So this is episode 31, and we're recording this on March 26, 2023.
On this episode, we begin by discussing China's diplomatic blitz, having brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran to resume diplomacy, as well as Xi's visit to Russia to meet with Putin and promote China's 12-point peace plan for the Russia-Ukraine war. We move on to the elections in Africa's largest democracy, Nigeria, and what the controversial elections say about the state of democracy in the country. Finally, we look to the world's largest democracy, India, and consider the steady rise of authoritarianism there. So, we just got back from India, which means that we are now experts on India. We spent 2 weeks there. We talked to our tour guide and a taxi driver.
And a tuk-tuk driver.
And, well, that's what I meant.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So this makes us the Tom Friedman level of experts on the country.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, we're totally qualified to write a column in the New York Times, basically just defining what U.S. policy should be towards India now.
Based on those two conversations.
Yeah, that's plenty. That's plenty. We talk politics, we talk Modi, we talk political parties.
I learned that Modi is very popular based on two sets of data points.
Yes, the two people we talked to, he was very popular with. Yeah, my conversation, particularly with the tuk-tuk driver, he was a huge fan, appreciated the economic growth that Modi was delivering, particularly to Delhi. The tour guide, I guess he is a little bit more balanced, or attempted to be a little bit more balanced, but just a little bit. Well, compared to the tuk-tuk driver.
We'll have to get a little bit more into that. But what else about our trip to India? What was your favorite part?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I mean, we did so much in those 2 weeks. It was easily the most jam-packed trip I think we've ever done together, maybe short of our little trip to Beijing when we first met. But I think like a lot of people, I didn't expect this, but I did enjoy the nature aspects of the interaction with the elephants and the tiger safari that we did. Those are probably the two biggest highlights for me.
Yeah, and it was unexpected. I mean, I saw National Park, Tiger Reserve, but I didn't think that we'd see tigers like that close to our Jeep, and a rare leopard sighting, and it was really fantastic. Yeah. So what was your second favorite?
It's hard to point out. I mean, obviously the wedding was certainly a spectacle. I think I keep going back to that word just because it was very over the top, which most Indian weddings are. And then given the fact that this was held at a converted palace in Udaipur, which was, as we learned, home of the various Maharajas during the pre-British period. And it was pretty unbelievable. You know, we narrowly pulled off our dance for the Sangeet, so the first day of the wedding festivities.
What are you talking about?
Well, we met the minimum that we needed to do in terms of not being the worst. And I felt, honestly, because Rebecca and I were talking about it last night, I feel like we were a solid, like, second or third best dance routine out of the 6 or so. Because some people repeated dances. I felt like we were second or third.
I do too. I think not crediting us in any way because we...
No, I was definitely not me. I was in the back. You guys are in the front kind of carrying the Kellogg family.
I think overall we had it was very well choreographed, and we stayed with that choreography. Like that was the important part, is we didn't have the same natural dancers that the bride's family had. You know, there were a couple.
We had one or two, yeah.
Who really stood out in their dancing skills, and they're obviously used to doing Indian weddings. But I think we did a really good job for having never done anything like that before. And again, maybe not our dancing skills, but in general, the group.
Yeah. Well, what about you? What kind of stood out for you?
I mean, one of the things I've always wanted to do was participate in a Hindu wedding. I mean, it was like a strange thing to want to do, I suppose, because we didn't know anyone, but it was a spectacle. But I think that word can be negative, and I wouldn't say that the negative connotation of it. It was something that's just, I learned that you cannot be too bedazzled. Like that first night thinking, I realized you could not have enough jewelry. You could not have enough bedazzlements in any part of the wedding. And I think, obviously the Tiger Reserve, the elephants, but my overall impression is just how colorful India is. And even, in the poor areas that we saw, everyone still wears these like really bright colors.
Yeah, the women, yeah.
And it kind of lifts the landscape a bit.
Yeah, it does. It does for sure.
Yeah. So, I think that was an impression, maybe more than a specific experience. And I'm glad I got to see the Taj Mahal. That was cool. I know you weren't as impressed as I was, but it was just something that is iconic in photos. And then seeing in the person, you get a little bit more the symmetry of it and why that is so impressive about the building. Like seeing it in person made it more beautiful to me.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things. It's like, well, everybody goes to India, goes to see the Taj Mahal. So it's a little bit of but it was impressive. It is massive in scale. So you don't really get that until you get up close. And then considering, the time period it was built in, it's a major architectural accomplishment. Not that I'm like a big appreciator of that, but it was amazing engineering and architectural feat for its era, for sure.
Yeah, it was really architecture's art, I thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I was impressed by that. I think our other experiences, as they tend to do, visiting a lot of forts and palaces, they kind of just all tend to blend together. But, you had seen one first, but I did finally get to see a snake charmer.
Yeah.
And one of our companions, he made her sit down next to him and hold the snake. And you can just see her shaking.
That was defanged, right? That was the deal. The snakes are defanged. Yeah.
It must have been.
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought about that till you said it, but...
No, somebody said that. I did. I don't think I made that up. I assume they don't want the tourists getting bitten by poisonous cobras.
I was looking at the video I took. Just the way they handle them so casually.
Yeah.
They're no fear whatsoever that the snakes could do anything to them. So, yeah. Anyway, so it was really, really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
I loved it. I miss it. It was exhausting.
Yeah, it was very exhausting. Our entire party went through multiple illnesses. We all essentially got COVID without knowing it, thinking it was a cold, but later finding out, and then various gastrointestinal issues. We won't go into details, but...
Yeah, it was extra exhausting because I was really sick. Not where I couldn't function, but sicker than I had been since pre-COVID times. I haven't had a cold or anything. So I thought that's just why I couldn't sleep, because I was coughing so much. And so it was hard to know though, between the exhaustion of just the pace that we were going at.
And the jet lag and the wedding versus the fatigue caused by COVID. So.
Yeah. It was a bit overwhelming at times.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk more about how we became experts and what our conclusions.
That's right. And in our last segment, you'll see that expertise in full display.
Exactly. So going to our first story, one thing that happened while we were gone that has been, started to happen while we were gone was China's global diplomacy that it employed. So one of the really big events that happened was China brokering a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia to restore their diplomatic relations. I think it's a big deal. You were less convinced by that, but I think it was a real show of carving influence.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, symbolically, it shows that China's looking to have a position in the region more than just an economic partnership, that it wants to have a political role. And that just that signaling alone, regardless of the substance behind it, is significant. Yeah.
Yeah. One, that is sort of China's MO, is to turn its economic might into political might. Yeah. And of course, that makes complete sense. The thing that is kind of notable, when we talked to Jonathan Fulton, there's this definitely the sense U.S. influence isn't going away. The sort of security relationships aren't going away. But China is finding a way to have influence. It doesn't have to just be, we can't replace the U.S., but is finding areas that the U.S. isn't in or can't do. I mean, one of the notable things about this is the U.S. could never have possibly brokered this deal, right? They don't have relations with Iran.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think, to me, that's really notable. China did something that the U.S. could not do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. They're finding these gaps. Now, I mean, as your interview with Fulton kind of covered, I mean, true, when it comes down to hard power, so in terms of like military ties, in terms of the economic ties and investment, and probably most importantly, the oil trade being priced in petrodollars. In terms of that sort of power, I mean, the U.S. is pretty firmly entrenched. But yeah, around these areas, and obviously Iran is the keystone to stability within the region, given the Shia-Sunni split. And you're right, only, especially with the falling apart of the nuclear deal under the Trump administration, China was the only one that can kind of play this role in terms of brokering this sort of deal. Yeah.
I want to push back on one thing that you said, that U.S. economic investments outweigh China. I mean, China's put substantial investments into Saudi Arabia and other countries. And I don't know that U.S.'s economic dominance is going to be unchallenged by China.
Yeah, I guess I'm waiting the defense purchases and that aspect of the relationship, probably combined with what future economic opportunities may be open through normalization of relationship with Israel being the economic powerhouse of the region. Obviously, these countries would benefit a lot, but that's not going to be without U.S. buy-in and concessions, for normalization. We've already seen, obviously, normalization with some of the Gulf states, but then to push forward with Saudi Arabia. So I guess it's kind of that economic aspect. But you're right. I mean, definitely probably in terms of the scale and the oil purchases, the energy purchases, because of relative direct U.S. energy independence and in a certain extent in terms of domestic production, the actual sales from Saudi Arabia are far less than China.
Mm-hmm. Another point to what you said is that, not that anything seriously has been done, but there are talks. Saudi Arabia has had talks with China about potentially pricing the oil it sells to China in China's currency, the yuan.
Yeah, they've had talks, but they haven't made any sort of substantial move.
But that would be
that would be a big deal. That would be a big deal. But so going into the details of the deal itself. So it was announced on March 10th, and the deal basically restores full diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And the first key step in this will be the reopening of their embassies, which they've committed to within a couple months. So it represented because there was a break essentially in relations for the last 7 years. And this was after the ransack of the Saudi Arabian embassy in Tehran, following the execution of a prominent Shia cleric in Saudi Arabia, which kind of surprised me. I thought the break was really kind of around the Yemen proxy war, but this actually preceded this. And I think the biggest thing, and is a benefit to all parties, including potentially the U.S. and even Israel, is if this offers a pathway to a formal end of this proxy war in Yemen, that could actually offer a lot of opportunities. And in fact, Axios reported that Israel does see this as a pathway for improved U.S.-Saudi relations due to the potential end of the conflict in Yemen, and that these improved relations would make it more likely that the normalization process between Israel and Saudi Arabia could be promoted. So I thought that was an interesting take, seeing what on surface just looks like a power play, clear benefit of Chinese power, and maybe alienating Israel to an extent. We're making it less likely that Saudi Arabia would back any sort of military strike on Iran, to where it's being interpreted as, well, this is a pathway to improve relationships between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, since that was a big sticking point, and something that the U.S. has gradually withdrawn as Saudi Arabia became more and more brutal, again, using U.S. equipment to conduct these atrocities, that this could actually be a pathway to improving those relationships and then allowing for normalization.
I think ending the war in Yemen is incredibly important, a net benefit to everyone. I'm not sure necessarily that it improves U.S.-Saudi Arabia relations, at least not in the near term. I honestly don't think Biden administration could get any deal with Saudi Arabia.
They're many steps away from one formally ending the Yemenis war. But I think following that, I mean, it seems possible. But that being said, I mean, Saudi Arabia has asked for a number of concessions in order for that to happen, including support for commercial nuclear energy. So there's just a number of sticking points. But I think if you get rid of this one, at least Israel sees it as a potential path. I thought there were other interesting takes from the Atlantic Council in terms of what additional steps you may see China take. And I thought the most interesting one, I don't see this happening, but it would be interesting if China were to seize upon it, but for them to take the lead in forcing Iran essentially back to the table. But I don't know if China actually has that leverage with Iran, or it's in Iran's interest to go back. But that would put the U.S. in a pretty awkward position in terms of, because obviously that's something the Biden administration has fully supported and tried to salvage and has been unsuccessful. If China was able to come in and get Iran to come back to the table, I mean, that would be a much bigger deal than this brokering of relationships between Saudi and Iran.
Yeah, and it depends on what role that China maybe continues to play in increasing the ties between the two countries. You know, it also might help the war in Syria, which is divided along these lines as well. What I think another takeaway is that the discussion around this goal has mostly been a zero sum. Like, China did this, and so this shows weakening American influence. Whereas maybe we need, or I think this is a net benefit for us. I think we need to be happy about that to some degree, instead of just looking at through the lens of, oh, China's gaining influence. But look, this is something that's a benefit to the region, a benefit to our own interests, and not everything China does is counter to our interests.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that's why it is interesting to see even Israel has more to lose from a weakening of the animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that even they see the opportunity in this to strengthen their position and kind of their objective. And I think there are a lot of good points on Iran itself. I mean, the big part of this is Iran has not been a good partner around previous peace deals. There's been kind of an ebb and flow, but ultimately there's good points being made that Iran's strategy for the region hasn't changed, nor has Iran's incentive for having a nuclear weapon, which it clearly sees as critical to its security. And, you know, honestly, based on U.S. actions in the region over the last 20 years, is a good interpretation of that. So how, in terms of normalization of this relationship, it doesn't seem like it'll be long before Iran has to back away or goes against this deal or does something counter to this. So I don't think there's a high trust level at all of this leading to anything greater than these embassies opening and maybe a pathway to ending the conflict in Yemen, which has obviously died down quite a bit over the last 9 months, a year.
Yeah. I mean, the atrocities in the war in Yemen are hard to state. That what has happened to the Yemenis is terrible and has not got enough attention. And Saudi Arabia's role in that, I think, has not gotten enough attention. And I've spoken about that before, but it would be really a big deal if they could get a permanent ceasefire between the two sides. Mm-hmm. And that itself would be a really huge benefit. But anyway, it's something to see. I think it's, no matter where this goes, it's a really important action by China that they were able to broker this deal.
Yeah, it is symbolically, if nothing else, that they are more than an economic player in the region.
So this week also saw China's President Xi going to Russia to meet with Putin for a 3-day meeting. And this caused a lot of hand-wringing and consternation in the West. There is, it may be notable about some of the things that didn't happen. one thing that really stood out to me was the fact that Putin didn't heartily endorse the 12-point peace plan, even though there's a lot of things that favor Russia in it. And you could have a meeting this big and not have Putin really fully endorse that was a notable thing that didn't happen.
Yeah, that definitely stood out because there's certainly a window of opportunity if Russia had chosen to seize it to lock in its current gains, its current territorial gains. But I've seen other analysts interpret that they still have maximalist goals for Ukraine. And because the peace plan does talk about respect for sovereign territory of nations. I don't know if that part kind of tweaked, but the fact that they didn't take up the opportunity to declare a ceasefire and say Russia's all for peace and the commitment to ending this war, and for them to lock in 1/6 of Ukraine's territory permanently, it seems like a missed opportunity for Russia to at least position itself with the global South, particularly as seeking peace and ending the damaging economic and inflationary environment caused by the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the fact that Putin has never acted all that logically when it comes to this war. It never made sense to kind of have this maximalist go after Kiev rather than just taking the territory that was already disputed indirectly by Russian forces. So that's why we were surprised by it. And I think, again, this is something totally illogical because Russia has the chance, like you said, it wins over probably the global South by looking like it's really intent towards peace. And Putin didn't take that opportunity, which is, I guess, more consistent with the puzzle of going after all of Ukraine. But especially now when it looks like Russia's suffered the losses that it has. Right.
So I think the other not really surprising thing, but certainly the way that it was pushed in the media here is no statement or change in Chinese policy around military support. I mean, I think China has continued to have a policy of essentially towing the line of making sure that it doesn't cross any sort of red lines with the West to trigger sanctions. So no greater public support for providing military aid to the Russian military. I mean, there are reports that supposedly they're providing small arms and some limited ammunition, maybe even being funneled through North Korea, but nothing to the scale of what Russia has requested.
So nothing that there's actually proof of. Here's my pet peeve on this. From the beginning of this meeting, it was, China's going there to announce this military support. And I feel like China's done a lot of things that hurt American interests, and we should acknowledge that. But we should also judge China by its actions. And I think too much we judge China about what we will fear that it will do, and not by what actually China is doing. And anyway, it's not a surprise to me at all that they did not announce this military support. It would have been more surprising, I think, if they did. And I can always be wrong because I am sometimes, but occasionally. I know, I admitted it.
Yeah, okay.
I admitted that I was wrong about
that's one step forward.
But yeah, this has been an annoyance to me that we keep acting like China's already done it. And like you said, I don't see it in China's interest. And unlike Putin, China doesn't go against its own interests because it doesn't want to run afoul of larger economic sanctions against it. And it wants to look like it's brokering peace.
Yeah, I think this dovetailed really nicely with the announcement of the Iran-Saudi Arabia normalization. Basically had this 1 week later. And yeah, you're coming out as, again, China's goal is to build an alternative to the U.S.-led world order and to offer a model to the global South of, hey, we're not going to interfere with your domestic sovereign affairs. We don't care about human rights and all of these Western values. We're here for economic growth and prosperity and peace. So I think this dovetails nicely with that overall message that China is bringing this 12-point peace plan. It's similar to the Iran-Saudi Arabia. It's the only credible partner that can come in and talk with both sides. Although Zelensky has expressed interest in talking to Xi, but that has yet to be scheduled.
They have a phone call scheduled.
Is that scheduled now?
I think so.
Okay. So that'll be interesting. Obviously, there's just non-starters right now in the plan. Any sort of locking in Russian gains, again, a mystery why Russia wouldn't accept and fully the Chinese peace plan. But, it's a non-starter for Zelensky. But it'll be interesting to see how that conversation goes, how much China...
I think it won't be that productive, but...
I don't think so either.
But it is really good for China in the sense of, they have this peace plan that they're promoting. No one else is promoting a peace plan. And so they get a lot of credit
for... The PR of it, again, the battle being with the Global South...
Right.
Looks good, yeah.
And I think that along with Saudi Arabia... It's sort of look, the U.S. isn't the only country that can have this influence on peace and international affairs. And look, we're able to do that in a way that is appealing to a lot of the Global South. So it's been a real huge positive for China this past couple of weeks.
Yeah, definitely from that perspective, I think so. Yeah, it's a diplomatic win for them, for the audience that they're targeting, both domestically and the Global South.
Yeah. And on a minor note, it's a busy week for Xi, too, because he has the president of Brazil, Lulu, coming to visit for a state visit. He has Macron coming this week for a state visit. And I believe it's this week. And then also scheduled a meeting with Spain's. And I guess the notable thing about that is Spain is going to be leading the EU Council.
Yeah, so clearly they haven't given up on their strategy around Europe. And then breaking off parts of Europe that are more sympathetic, we're more economically dependent on China than other parts. So yeah, you can just see that somewhat lack of unity. Not that, although I'm a little surprised Macron kind of a full state visit to Beijing during this time period. It's a little surprising. Spain, I see. Brazil, I totally get. But France has always been independent in terms of its diplomatic policy, and obviously he's maintained that those phone calls with Putin is probably the only window that the West has to those ineffective phone calls to Putin.
It's true. Very true. So on to our next topic, which are the elections that recently occurred in Nigeria.
Yeah, so Nigeria is Africa's largest democracy, and they held in the past month both national presidential elections and state elections. And Nigeria, we have to remember, is still a very young democracy. I always have to remind myself that military rule only ended in 1999 because I spent a little bit of time working in Nigeria in 2007.
Also making you an expert now in Nigeria.
Right. Well, yeah, definitely. I was there for weeks. So that's a global expert. I should be on CNN with that sort of experience. But anyway, so it was a democracy that was only 8 years old when I spent some time there. And honestly, the stories and themes in terms of the country's function really hasn't changed that much since that time period, sadly. And it's just been burdened by a very deeply corrupt elite that essentially used the country's considerable oil wealth as a private bank account. Now, that being said, what's a little bit tragic is Nigeria has immense potential. I mean, it's the most populous country in Africa, the largest economy in Africa. Over half of the population is actually 18 years or younger. So unlike parts of the West and Asia, it's very young and dynamic. But in terms of opportunities, it's just been really starred by this corruption. So there's a lot of frustration that existed heading into these elections. For instance, youth unemployment currently runs at 42%, which is just staggering. And since the last national election in 2015, Nigerians' GDP per capita has actually fallen since that time. And you have 60 million within the country that are surviving on less than $2 a day. But there was hope heading into the election. So it was headed up by three different parties. You had kind of the two dominant parties that had kind of exchanged rule over the last 20 years or so. But there was an outsider by the name of Peter Obi, who is the leader of the newly formed Labour Party and a former state governor. and really appeared to offer some hope for reform, particularly among younger Nigerians. And he's a banker by background. And I think it wasn't so much the policies, because all Nigerian politicians are very vague on any sort of policy solutions to the number of problems that the country faces, but it was rather his style. Unlike the current national leaders who act more or less like kings and have full entourages and are pretty arrogant, he was known for a very humble style, a real focus on frugality, which is, again, it's more the display of ostentatious wealth that you would see amongst the elite. So it was seen as kind of a fresh air and the focus to, again, combating corruption and trying to focus on economic growth and development. And in fact, Obi was leading heading into the election in late February in a number of polls. But in a surprise, it was Bola Tinubu, who's part of the incumbent ruling party, the APC, that won the presidential election. So Tinubu took over 37% of the vote, followed by the other major party, Abu Bakr, who took 29%, and then Obi, kind of the insurgent, coming up with only 25%. Now, because of this difference in the polls, and also the fact that Nigeria moved to a electronic voting system, which I think, we saw something similar in Kenya when we talked about that election in an earlier episode. But there was just a number, the vote was marred by a number of reported attacks by armed men, vote buying, snatching of ballot boxes, and ballot burning. And then you had very low turnout, which I think is really indicative of the level of trust and faith within the democratic system, is the fact you only had 25% of registered voters cast a ballot, and that was down from 35%. Again, pretty low numbers for a young democracy. By contrast, the U.S. has been trending upward, is probably close to 60-some%, I think, in national elections now. So the country is really braced for a repeat of the 2011 elections, where 800 people were killed. But I think ultimately, the positive signs, and the Washington Post editorial board actually had, a lot of praise for how the election went, which, given the list of reasons that we kind of went through, was a little bit shaky. But
a little bit?
Yeah, I was a little surprised by it.
I didn't agree with it at all.
Yeah, do you want to go into that?
Yeah, so they say that they largely praise the election, citing that the losing candidates are pursuing their appeals in court rather than insurrection, which I guess is true. I don't know that that's an improvement over previous elections in Nigeria. The military stayed on the sidelines, as they have for the last 20 plus years. They called it the most competitive election in Nigeria's history, with states' vote split among multiple candidates. That's true. They say, and here's where I disagree with them a lot, that the voting issues appear mostly related to technical issues with the electronic system, not fraud, and the U.S. and others have accepted the results. And here I have contend on several points. One, nothing that I read said mostly it was technical issues. The problems with the election included a lot of violence, burning of ballots, vote buying. When you have only 25% of people come out, which also is something that I think they don't take into account well enough. Probably fear of violence, right? Not only lack of trust in the system, but fear of violence. And that's not a sign of a healthy democracy. Yes, the US and others have accepted the results, but international observers also said that Nigerians deserved better, and have certainly not. It was not been a ringing endorsement of a fair and free election system.
Yeah, I think that is what, surprised me, given the wide-scale reports. And this is also because there was youth excitement about Obi. There were a lot of coverage on social media, a lot of people reporting from polling places that the results that were reported and recorded at the local level were different than what ended up kind of in the national election database. Obviously, the wide-scale violence, which is, has been a common occurrence in Nigeria elections, but shouldn't be a point of, I guess, praise by the Washington Post editorial board. The biggest thing is the Nigerian people deserve better than this. I mean, the ultimate winner, Tinubu, was actually accused by the U.S. of illicit activities back in the 90s of drug sales. I think eventually they reached agreement, but then his closest opponent, so the Abu Bakr, was also accused of money laundering, essentially a $40 million transfer to U.S. bank accounts that was seen as illicit or ill-gotten gains. So neither one of these individuals, and Obi himself had more minor kind of accusations of corruption, but
I mean, they deserve a better election process. They deserve
better candidates too.
Right, but let's just start with the democratic process, which is limited. It's not a full democracy in terms of how we think of democracy.
Right.
Freedom House calls it partially free, and that has to do with the electoral system, the judicial system being free of government influence, and freedom of the press, all things that Nigeria scores not very well on.
Right, right.
So, as we're going to talk about in the next segment, when we call these countries a democracy, they're not necessarily democracies, or certainly depends on how you define democracy. Because if you look at the indicators that like political scientists look at when we are coding whether a country is a democracy or not, VDEM is probably one of the most popular, and it lists both Nigeria and India, which we're going to be talking about, as electoral autocracies, which means there are elections, but it is not a fair and free democracy. Freedom House calls them partially free, which sort of reflects the same sentiment. So I think sometimes I question a little bit about the way we use the word democracy.
Yeah, that it's more than the presence of elections, that it's an entire system, and it goes with press freedom, academic freedom, independence of the judiciary, independence of the legislature, entire kind of ecosystem that has to exist for democracy to function beyond just elections.
But the one positive thing I would say about Nigeria compared to what we're going to be talking about in a minute is that there is a real strong opposition, that they're not just jailing opposition candidates.
Yeah, there is, but there's, I'd say, probably even a higher degree of collusion amongst elites on the agreement that regardless of who wins, that we get to essentially extract resources for our personal gain.
Yeah. Corruption is
the corruption's greater than what you see in India, which I think, and I think this will tie to our next topic as well, and is something that came up in our trip to India and ties into China's alternative model of development is, does democracy hold back developing countries? Do you actually need a stronger non-democratic, illiberal government in order to have economic growth and prosperity for your people? I mean, China would point to Nigeria and say, look at this chaos. Look at this. This is insane. There's so much corruption.
But that's not because it's a democracy. In fact, authoritarian governments usually rank much higher on corruption than democratic.
I mean, that would be the counter. It wasn't like, although honestly, maybe Nigeria relative to other countries during the military rule was probably better off than this period under democracy. That's what China would point to.
I think it's really a false argument. Certainly what we call democracy in Nigeria has declined over the years. At the same time, economic development has declined. So increasing some authoritarian measures has not produced economic growth in Nigeria. I think it's a false argument.
Well, but this is the argument that the U.S. and the West have to counter if they hope to break off or not allow for the diplomatic blitz in the global South that China is now undertaking. How is the Western model better than the Chinese model of development?
Yeah, and then we talked about the surveys in Africa, how survey-wise, people had a lot of support for democracy while also supporting China's economic development model. So it's not, in the global South, it's not an either or. We try to make it either or, but it certainly hasn't decreased the yearning for democracy. they want both, and they don't see like that they can't have democracy and economic growth. I don't think people will see that.
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right with the Afro-Barometer. And that wasn't universal across countries, but right. Nigeria was one of the strongest ones who had very positive feelings both for the United States and China. And I think the reaction that you saw online with Nigerians, with the Nigerian diaspora, some of them kind of symbolically ripping their passports up, there is a strong commitment to democracy within the country. Although, you look at the participation rates and you go, well, how strong is that?
But that may not be, it may be indicative of the electoral process rather than, if there's armed gangs, you hear reports.
So probably the polls from Afro-Barometer are a better indicator of commitment to democracy rather than, because you're right, the violence and all sorts of shenanigans going on. Yeah.
I can't imagine what it's like to live in Nigeria, but I could definitely see that being as a reason why.
Not to go to the poll. Yeah.
So, on a more depressing note about democracy is India. And I don't think I had...
More depressing.
Well, I didn't realize, I knew there was growing authoritarianism under Modi, but I don't think I realized how bad it really was. So, one of the things we noted by the couple of people we talked to, that's also confirmed by articles that we have read, is the popularity of Modi. And under him, we've seen a lot of measures that have further deteriorated India's democracy. So it's also ranked as partially free and as an electoral autocracy, which is just kind of shocking to me. Like I said, I knew it was trending in that direction, but I didn't realize till we were on the plane and kind of reading the magazine about Indian politics. I don't think I realized how weak the democracy was there. And one element of it, I think, is when you can jail your opponents. That gives you a lot of power. And I know we're going to talk about one case of that. But also, for me, Modi is popular because he's developed economic growth. He's put in the infrastructure that he's promised, and India is seeing a lot of economic growth. Now, some of that I don't think it can all be attributed to Modi, because India is also just kind of at the right time right now when people are looking to move out of China for the cost of labor as well as geopolitical reasons. And I think India is in the moment where it gets to take advantage of that. But I think the infrastructure helps. And as long as Modi can deliver on those goods, I don't think anything can truly challenge his power and the way that he's bringing the country into a more authoritarian direction. That's why I think it's depressing.
I completely agree with that overall trajectory. And part of this is to blame. Yes, he's definitely benefiting from timing to a certain extent, but you had near total control of the country for generations by the Indian National Congress, and they failed to deliver on basic infrastructure improvements. And that was, we didn't talk about in the trip, but that stood out to me the most. We traveled through Rajasthan, one of the poorest states within India, and I was shocked. I was shocked by just how abysmal most of the infrastructure, the one exception being electricity, where the country has 95% coverage, but that apparently, again, something that the Modi government had focused on. But even things basic as toilets. So even pit toilets were not common prior to Modi in these regions and had been ignored by the Indian National Congress. So I can totally see if a government comes in from a party that did not deliver these basic goods and services to its people for 30, 40 years, they come in and they're able to deliver this within 10 years and make real material impact on these areas and regions. I totally get why they're extremely popular. So it's like that aspect of it, I get why. But obviously, BJP and Modi are also locking in unnecessarily, because I think they can win free and fair elections just based on what they've been able to accomplish economically. But instead, they're using their power to disassemble democracy over time. And I think we saw two incidences of that while we were in India that really spoke to this. So the most recent one that happened was the leader of the India Congress Party, Rahul Gandhi, was removed from his seat of parliament following a conviction of criminal defamation charge from a 2019 comment on the political trail at the time. And it essentially was just a joke. So it's one, shocking that he was convicted, but it was kind of interesting that the law is actually a legacy of British colonial speech restrictions that was upheld by the India Supreme Court in 2016. Again, I don't know how much that is influenced by BJP appointees, but it represented a giant blow to a family legacy, because this is the same Gandhi. He's the grandson of Indira Gandhi, who was the prime minister from 1966 to 1977, and then later served in the 80s before she was assassinated. But she, in turn, was the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, who was India's first prime minister. And I think that's the other shocking thing. Is not only is this the leader of the opposition, but this is the leader of a political dynasty, essentially taken out based on a joke using an extremely strict interpretation of a colonial law.
And the joke was that he compared Modi to thieves or something like that.
Yeah, it was two other, I guess, known people with the same last name. And essentially saying, you can't trust these Modi guys, are all thieves. I mean, that was like the extent of the joke in 2019. But then conveniently, it wasn't pursued as a legal case until Gandhi was getting traction in recent weeks and months, linking Modi to the scandal around the Adani Group, which is one of India's wealthiest businessmen and wealthiest corporations, which has been mired in charges of just like massive hundreds of billions of dollars of stock manipulation and accounting fraud. So this is actually a real sensitive area for Modi. So it's just convenient that as soon as he was getting traction linking, that they pursued this 2019 case against him.
Yeah, so when you can get rid of your opponent using this law for such a minor offense, and you can just get rid of him.
Yeah.
They booted him immediately from the parliament.
Yeah, they didn't wait for appeals or anything.
Then, I mean, you can do pretty much anything. You eliminate a real opposition. And, you talk about like Modi's popularity when, he's not a lot of threat to his power, but even winning is sometimes not enough for these leaders. They want to make constitutional changes, which Modi has made. They want to lock in authoritarianism and increase their power over all aspects of state control. India it's kind of a federated system because it also has a lot of states which have their own politics and independent policy that they can carry out. So this is really, really troubling. It was really troubling to me. And I think we have to consider how long we call India a democracy.
Yeah, no, I think, definitely the labeling is one aspect. But, regardless of the label, the fact is, and you brought this up, the timing for India, given the desire in the West to have this alternative kind of on the manufacturing side and trade side to China, as well as a valuable defense partner, means that there's not going to be any international implications. You can label, academics can label India whatever it wants, but in terms of actual sanctions or censure against India and its government, that's not going to happen.
That's why the West will keep calling it a democracy, because it's convenient for them, even though India is definitely moving away from that, and it's questionable how true that label is. It's convenient for the West to call it a democracy for these leaders as they're working with it.
Yeah, I think particularly with the framing, which the Biden administration has backed off on, but this democracy versus autocracy. And of course, India itself, its entire brand, or a big part of its brand internationally, is being the world's largest democracy.
Right.
And obviously Modi fully embraces that and say, yes, we're 100% a democracy. So it's in everybody's interest, it seems like, to continue to call India a democracy, even if its institutions are kind of rotted away over time.
Some other indications. So when we mentioned there were two opposition members, there was another one who is also thrown in jail. Very complex scandal related to liquor store licensing. And I've read like 500 articles and I would not be able to sum it up.
Yeah. No.
But that is really hard to determine how much that is true or not true. Also because of that there is very little press freedom in the country, particularly amongst Muslim reporters. So you have to also say again, too, that there is a lot of increasing Hindu nationalism, which is basically, as our tour guide put it, that we're not asking people to accept Hinduism as their religion, but the values of Hinduism, which is the foundation of India. And so, but this has led to a lot of attacks on Muslims, a lot of violence toward Muslims, as well as eroding their rights. And also, when they are journalists and academics, you also have press such as the BBC was raided following the airing of a documentary critical of Modi. You have international organizations like Amnesty International and Oxfam who were also raided for similar reasons. And I think I was reading that they don't operate in India anymore. So this lack of freedom of information, essentially, is one of the core of democracies. So having press freedom, and then, of course, academic freedom goes along with that. You can't have a democracy without it because you have to be able to hold people accountable. And if you don't have any voices that you can trust that can be critical of Modi or his actions or his government, then, again, people are only going to see the information that they're given, right? That's why China controls information so much. So that really deteriorates the idea that you can be a democracy. So for that reason, we've talked a little bit. Freedom House has concluded that security, defamation, sedition. So there's also, as I read through this list, there been a high increase of people who have been accused of sedition. And again, this seems largely along political lines. Anyone who has some sort of opposition against Modi, hate speech laws. Again, there's just been a lot of ways that they've been able to attack oppositional voices.
Yeah, on the one hand, you understand, given the failure of the party, the Indian National Congress, to deliver on results, but then the fact that Modi has used the success and the fortuitous timing of India in the geopolitical realm in terms of economic gain and growth that they've been able to realize to very systematically, this is a very disciplined approach to disassembling oppositional parties over time. And now, just these two bold actions around both Gandhi and Sisodia, the person at the center of the liquor gate scandal, to do this so boldly, to take out your opponents, just shows that he's reached a level of comfort knowing that there's going to be no blowback. And this isn't the end of it. I was reading that there are other, because anybody that gets any sort of national exposure, retraction that could potentially one day be a threat to snuff them out from political life as soon as possible. It is very systematic and chilling in that way.
Right. So I think it's understandable why they're labeled an electoral autocracy, which basically means we also call it competitive authoritarianism when there are elections, but those elections are not fair and free because of press freedom or your opposition not being jailed for reasons and such. So it was depressing to me to find out how bad India's state of democracy is, and then knowing that things are not going to get better. It's just going to continue to deteriorate. And I think, like we said, we call it the world's largest democracy because of its population size. And so to see this trend there is particularly troubling. Okay. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's an episode.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me, A.R. Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email. So Anita at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com. And as always, please see the show notes for the articles we discussed in this episode. And if you like the show, please take time, tell your friends, share it on social sites. It's a simple, quick, and free way to support the show.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.